Welcome back to another discussion of Cold Season 3. This time we're talking about Episode 5 with host Dave Cawley. Hi, Dave.
Hey, how's it going, Becky?
Not too shabby. How in the world was Cary allowed to have relatives in his police lineup?
This is one of the most baffling parts of this entire story as we look at Cary Hartmann coming under suspicion in this serial rape investigation. This narrative that forms that was not really talked about publicly before it was included in Episode 5 of Cold Season 3 is that one of the women who was accusing Cary Hartmann of rape went to pick him out of a police lineup. And Cary, through his defense attorney, arranged to have his younger brother Jack Hartmann and his cousin David Hartmann in the lineup with him. And so you can imagine this woman standing on, one side of the reflective glass looking through at these men. She sees three of them look very much alike. Now, we also know that Cary Hartmann did a couple of things prior to the lineup to change his appearance. He had a mustache. He shaved off his mustache. He lightened his hair. Meanwhile, his cousin, who bore a striking resemblance to Cary, still had a mustache, still had dark hair. And so a transcript of the lineup that Cold obtained exclusively through an open records request reveals the woman went back and forth. She looked at Cary. She thought he looked like the right person. She looked at the cousin, thought he also looked like the right person, actually asked the police if they could tell her which one of them was the suspect. And they, of course, told her no, they could not. As far as I can tell, this was highly irregular to have relatives of a suspect included in a lineup. It was very clearly designed to make it more difficult for the victim to identify the person who she believed had attacked her. And in fact, it worked. And it's probably the result of a very smart and aggressive defense attorney.
At the end of the day, though, it also struck me, I thought for sure you were setting us up to find out that was going to be the reasonable doubt when this thing went to trial. And yet she still identified him in court, and that was enough.
It's really interesting because then it goes in front of a jury, right? So the same woman who had a difficult time identifying her attacker in the lineup goes to the witness stand in court, and she very clearly points at Cary Hartmann at the defense table and says, well, he's the suspect. And so Cary Hartmann's defense attorney obviously seizes on that and says something to the effect of, well, you couldn't pick him out of this lineup, and yet you're so sure now, to try to undermine her testimony. But a jury sitting in that room evaluating the evidence is going to take into account the fact that there were relatives in the lineup. And I think what we see in the verdict that they end up handing down, which is, of course, guilty against Cary Hartmann, is that they were not put off by the idea that just because she had difficulty differentiating these Hartmann men in the lineup, that they didn't trust her identification in the courtroom.
You go into quite a bit of detail, but selectively so, on Cary's pre-sentencing report. And I thought that was really interesting. To somebody who is not in our line of work, why were you so careful with those details?
So to answer that question, let me describe a little bit about what goes into a pre-sentence report. In the state of Utah, pre-sentence reports are prepared by an agency called Adult Probation and Parole. A judge will ask AP&P, as it's called, to have an agent do an investigation and summarize everything that's relevant for the judge to know about this defendant who they are going to sentence. And so the investigator will go out, they'll speak to relatives of the accused, they'll speak to the defendant, his or herself, they'll talk to victims, family members, witnesses, police, prosecutor, anybody involved in the case, and put all of that information together in a summary and then make a recommendation at the end what the agency feels would be the most appropriate. Because these interviews involve talking to victims, talking to witnesses, some of whom may not be known publicly. Pre-sentence reports in the state of Utah are not public records. They are protected. I was able to obtain Cary Hartmann's pre-sentence report, but because it includes all of that kind of sensitive information, including the accounts of people who he was accused of assaulting, or past romantic partners, people who were not publicly identified in court, I felt it was very important that we do what we can to protect those people's privacy, not just blast out every detail in that document because we had it. There's a balance that needed to be struck between what is relevant for somebody looking into the story to know versus the potential harm that could be done by just sharing anything willy-nilly.
A common thread in all 3 seasons of Cold so far has been the use of public records. And I realize pre-sentencing reports are not public records. Right. But could you just kind of walk the audience through how important it is for you as a journalist to be able to access those public records and report on them?
Records are the bedrock of investigative reporting. They're really where I start the process of researching a story or researching a case, especially one that is as old as the Sheree Warren case that we're talking about in Cold Season 3, 1985. It's a long time ago. And many of the people who I might want to talk to are frankly deceased at this point, or their memories aren't great because so many years have passed. And so by going back and looking at the records that were created originally, it sets kind of the facts out in a way that I can then go back to these people, ask them, relevant questions, or even refresh their memories sometimes by showing them the record or asking them specifically if they remember details, from the record. The records also allow us to do very basic work like creating a timeline. Who did what when, who said what when, and that allows us to then understand how an investigation progresses and develops and changes over time. Without those records, we really have no great way of validating what people tell us when we sit down to interview them and ask them questions for Cold.
So much more gets covered in this episode. How can people find it?
Absolutely. So Cold Season 3, Episode 5 is available right now for free anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you would like to binge the entire series, you can do so with an Amazon Prime account through Amazon Music.